There is a moment between heartbeats when the world stops pretending, when everything you carried, the arguments, the grudges, the noise you confuse for living, falls away like old bark from a winter tree. I know that moment. I lived inside it. I was 97 years old, and my heart quit. Not nearly, not almost. It stopped the way a clock stops when the last spring unwinds, and there is nothing left to pull. My name is Celestine Odette Beaumont. I was born in a town so small it doesn't appear on maps that matter. A stretch of red Louisiana clay called Pirogue Hollow, where the cypress trees leak Spanish moss into the water, and the air in August feels like something alive pressing against your skin. I came into this world in 1927, the third daughter of a woman who could recite scripture in 3 languages, and a man who laid railroad ties until his back refused the work. I leave it, if I leave it, knowing things I was never supposed to know on this side of death. So before you decide what to do with what I am about to tell you, I want you to understand who is telling it. I am not impressionable. I am not soft in the mind. My great-niece, who is a physician in Atlanta, had me tested 3 years ago because she worried. The neurologist handed her the results and said, and I quote, "There is nothing wrong with this woman's cognition that the rest of us wouldn't envy. I raised 6 children in circumstances that would have extinguished most. I buried a son. I buried a husband who was the better half of me for 51 years. I marched. I organized. I prayed in jailhouses and in mansions and in the hollow space between. I have earned the right to be believed." The night it happened, it was late October. My granddaughter Zia had come to stay, sleeping in the small room off the kitchen, the way she did when she visited. And I remember hearing her breathing go soft and even to the thin wall before I felt the first sign that something had shifted. It was not pain exactly. It was more like a subtraction. Like the room was slowly removing itself from me, or I from it, the way fog lifts from water at dawn. Not all at once, but in quiet, unhurried pieces. I thought about calling for Zia. The thought formed clearly, deliberately, and then dissolved before I could act on it. And then the subtraction became total. What came next, I will spend the rest of my living days trying to put into language that does not shrink it into something smaller than it was. The closest I can manage is this. Imagine you have lived your entire life inside a house with all the curtains drawn. And suddenly, in one instant, every curtain is pulled aside and every window thrown open, and you understand that the light outside was never darkness. It was only that you had never been positioned to receive it. I was not floating. That is the word people use, and it is wrong. I was arrived. That is what it felt like, as though everything I had called movement my entire life had been a long preparation for simply being where I already was. And in that place, which had no temperature, no geography, no smell, yet felt more real than any room I had ever stood in, I was not alone. I want to be precise here because precision matters. I did not see a figure in a robe. I did not see a bearded silhouette backlit by gold. What I encountered was more like a presence that had personality, that was oriented toward me with a specificity that no stranger ever brings. The way only someone who has known you for the full length of your life can look at you and see not just what you are now, but everything you were on the way here. And I knew. The knowing did not require introduction or confirmation. I simply knew who held me in that gaze. He did not open with comfort. He opened with a question, not in words, in the way a single long look from someone who loves you completely can ask everything without a syllable. And what the look asked was, "Are you ready to see clearly?" And I understood that I was about to be shown something I had not asked to see. That is the detail I keep returning to when the skeptical part of my mind goes looking for holes in my own memory. I did not want this vision. I was not the person in this congregation who raised her hand the highest or spoke in the most theatrical terms about divine revelation. If I am being fully candid, I had always been quietly suspicious of people who reported these things. I thought them well-meaning, but perhaps too eager for significance. So when what came next arrived, it arrived against the grain of everything I would have constructed for myself. He showed me this country, not as an abstraction, not as a symbol. He showed it to me the way you watch someone you have raised from infancy, with the full weight of investment, with the particular grief that only comes from loving something that has the freedom to choose poorly. I saw it whole. I saw its beauty first, which is something we forget to do. The sheer, unearned, extravagant beauty of the land itself. The mountains that don't apologize for their scale. The coastlines that have been receiving the sea for longer than any name we've given them. The interior plains where the sky is so wide it makes the concept of a ceiling feel like an insult. And then I saw what had happened to the people inside it. I saw fracture. Not the fracture of poverty or of violence, though those were present too. I saw the specific fracture that comes when a community that was meant to be unified around something eternal gets reorganized around something temporary. I saw people who shared a faith that should have been larger than any earthly allegiance, lined up against each other with a fury that belonged to a different kind of war entirely. And the source of the alignment was not doctrine. It was not theology. It was a man. Here is where I must slow down. Here is where I ask you to stay with me, even if your instinct is to leave. Because what I am about to tell you is precisely the kind of thing I would have dismissed if someone else had come to me with it first. And that discomfort is exactly why I trust it. He showed me Donald Trump. I am a woman of particular political convictions that I arrived at through 97 years of watching this country decide who it valued. My convictions did not lean in the direction you might expect, given what I have just told you I was shown. That is the point. That is exactly the point. Because what was shown to me was not an endorsement. It was not a coronation. It was more like an explanation of mechanics, the way an engineer might show you not whether they approve of a levee, but how a levee functions and why its placement matters in the particular landscape it occupies. The presence beside me, and I will keep calling it that because I am not going to reduce it to something smaller than it was, showed me forces, not political forces, something older, something that did not originate in any election cycle or news cycle. Forces that the ancient texts have names for, that most modern people have decided are metaphorical, because the metaphor is more comfortable than the alternative. These forces, as I understood them in that place, had a directional intention, They were moving toward something. They were organized around a removal, the removal of something foundational that had been quietly holding. And against those forces, in the arrangement I was being shown, this man had been positioned, not because of his character, not because of his virtue, which I was not shown as extraordinary, but because of a particular quality of resistance. The way certain materials are useful in construction, not because they are beautiful or even pleasant to work with, but because they do not compress under load. That was the quality I was shown, a refusal to be moved by the specific pressures that were being applied. And then, this is the part that cracked something open in me. He showed me the church watching all of this happen. His church. The people who carried his name. The people who gathered weekly in buildings with his words posted on their walls. And they were not praying. They were arguing. They were not on their knees. They were at keyboards. They were not interceding for the nation. They were performing for each other, auditioning their outrage, cataloging their opponent's sins, and calling the performance righteousness. One group had taken this man and lifted him to a height that belonged to someone else entirely, had folded their faith into their politics until the two were indistinguishable, until you could not find the seam. The other group had taken their very legitimate grievances and fed them until the grievances were larger than their prayers, until their opposition to one man had become the organizing principle of their spiritual lives in a way that the one they claimed to follow had never asked for and would not recognize. And between those two groups, in the space that should have been filled with unified, focused, fervent intercession, there was simply noise. He grieved. I felt that grief as something physical, even though I had no body. It was not the grief of defeat. It was the grief of someone watching a house they built with their own hands be slowly dismantled by the people they had entrusted it to, not in malice, but in distraction. Not because they stopped caring, but because they had been so thoroughly redirected that they had forgotten what they originally came here to do. And he said to me, and I am choosing these words with the full weight of my 97 years, because I know the difference between what I remember and what I imagine. He said something that I will carry until I go back to that light and stay. The loudest voices in my house are the quietest in my presence. I turned that sentence over for weeks after I woke up in the hospital. I turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lives underneath. And every time I turned it, it meant the same thing. The people most visible in the public performance of faith were the least present in the private practice of it. The ones most eager to tell the country what God required of it were the ones least acquainted with what God actually said when you sat with him in silence long enough to stop talking and start listening. He showed me one more thing before he told me it was time to return. He showed me what was possible, not what was guaranteed, not what was fated, what was possible, which is a different and in many ways more demanding gift because possibility requires participation. I saw this country's congregations, all of them, every denomination, every tradition, every size, spread across every geography. And I saw them choose, in this vision, to redirect. to put down the particular weapons they had picked up against one another, to close the browser windows, to turn away from the arguments that had been specifically engineered to keep them in a state of agitation, and to pray. Not the performative prayer of public address, though there is a place for that. The other kind. The kind that happens before sunrise. The kind that happens in the middle of the night when something wakes you and you understand that the waking was not accidental. The kind that is less about words and more about positioning. Simply making yourself available to be used by something larger than your own understanding. When they did this in the vision, when these scattered and quarreling congregations chose the interior work over the exterior fight, what followed was not what I expected. I expected something dramatic, something visible. I expected the darkness I had seen gathering at the edges of this nation to be dispelled in some cinematic, conclusive way. What I saw instead was slower and more permanent. The darkness did not disappear. It retreated. It recalibrated. It encountered resistance of a kind it had not anticipated and could not easily overcome, because the resistance was not organized in any of the ways it knew how to neutralize. It was not a political movement. It had no branding. It could not be argued with or made into a scandal. It was simply the accumulated weight of 10,000 private moments of surrender to something the darkness could not touch. And the country on the other side of that retreat looked different. Not perfect, not fixed, but oriented differently. As though it had been reminded of something it had almost entirely forgotten about its own original posture. Then it was over. Then I was back. The return was not gentle. It was a reinsertion, a thud of materiality, the sudden overwhelming fact of a body with its aches and its weight and its requirements. I heard machines. I heard voices with urgency in them. I heard my great-niece Zia say something I could not fully parse because I was still too new to being back inside language. The doctors told me later that my heart had been silent for over 3 minutes, that the probability of my returning without significant loss was low, that whatever had happened was not something they had a satisfying clinical account for. I told the attending physician, a young woman with tired eyes and a practical manner, that I had been somewhere and been sent back with instructions. She wrote something on her clipboard and did not look at me strangely, which I appreciated. She said, "Mrs. Beaumont, I believe you. I have thought about whether to share this. I have sat with it through the long Louisiana nights, through the months since that October, and I have argued with myself at length, because I know what it costs to say something like this in public. I know the particular social transaction involved, the way some people will use it for things I did not intend, the way others will use their dismissal of it as evidence of their own sophistication. I know all of that. But I made a promise. I made it in a place where I understood with absolute completeness that promises are not performances. I made it without witnesses except one, and one was sufficient. And the content of the promise was simple. Everything you showed me, you will say. Every piece, even the ones that will cost you something. Even the ones that resist easy summary, even the ones that will be misread and misused by people pulling in opposite directions. all of it. So here is what I was sent back to say, as plainly as I can manage in the time and the words I have. God is not finished with this country. That is not a political statement. That is a factual report from someone who was shown the alternative and brought back specifically to deliver the news that the alternative is not yet necessary. He is not finished. But the church, his people, the ones who carry his name and gather in his honor and claim his authority, must return to the work they were assembled to do, not the work of political alignment, not the work of cultural warfare, the interior work, the quiet, unwitnessed, unglamorous work of actual prayer, actual intercession, actual willingness to go into the private room and speak to the one who can do something about what is happening, rather than broadcasting into the public air at people who cannot. The man at the center of the current storm is not the point. He never was. He is a detail in a much larger situation, positioned as he was positioned for reasons that have more to do with the nature of what he resists than the nature of what he embodies. Treat him as the point in either direction, either elevating him beyond what he is or making opposition to him the cornerstone of your spiritual identity, and you have missed the assignment entirely. Both errors serve the same interest, and it is not yours. The point is the flame. The point is whether the people who carry that flame choose to feed it or allow it to flicker down to nothing, while they argue about things that will not matter in the place I visited. I am 97 years old. I have one son in the ground and a husband waiting for me somewhere I've already had a glimpse of. I have no personal stake in how this country's next election unfolds or which party holds which chamber. I have no axe to grind and no audience to build. I am a woman from a town that doesn't appear on maps that matter, and I was shown something I did not ask to see, and I promised to say it, and so I have. The window is not closed. That was the last thing I understood before the machine started beeping, and Zia's voice came through the wall of my returning. The window is still open. The choice is still available. The outcome is not written yet, because outcomes of this kind are not predetermined. They are co-created between the one who is not finished and the people who decide whether they are finished. He is not finished. Are you?